Welcome to the Drawing Room Detectives, where London's fog conceals more than just shadows, and every coin may carry the weight of a darker story. Tonight's case begins not in a grand estate or private club, but on the cold stones of Whitechapel, where a beggar is found dead, clutching a single copper penny. When a banker soon meets the same fate, Holmes suspects something far more deliberate than coincidence. Poison, pride, and a thirst for justice mingle in this chilling tale of revenge. This is the case of the poisoned penny. Before we begin, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? Drop it in the comments below and let the mystery unite us across time and place. Chapter 1. A Penny for the Dead. It was in the chill of early March, when the London fog is thickest and least forgiving, that Holmes and I found ourselves drawn into what at first appeared a wretchedly ordinary tragedy. Inspector Lestrade had telegraphed us that morning from Commercial Street Station, requesting our attendance in Whitechapel. His message was brief and lacked any dramatic flourish, always a signal, I had learned, that something troubled him more than he cared to admit. Beggar found dead, no wounds, no theft. One coin clutched in hand, odd smell, no answers. L. Holmes read it aloud over a slice of dry toast and did not look up as he spoke. Lestrade is being more concise than usual, he said, which either means he is short on coffee or longer on questions than answers. Do you think it worth the journey? I asked. A beggar dying in Whitechapel is hardly cause for astonishment. Holmes smiled slightly, the kind of expression that accompanied his keener instincts. And yet it is cause for curiosity when a man dies with a clenched fist and no visible cause. Come, Watson, let us see if death was as natural as Lestrade would like it to be. The corpse lay in a narrow alley off Hanbury Street behind a shuttered tobacconist's. A constable stood watch, while a few onlookers, mostly pale-faced boys and grey-coated hawkers, lingered at a distance, murmuring. The body, when we approached, had already stiffened. The man could not have been more than 45, though street life had weathered him into something older. His boots were split, his coat torn at the seams, and his breath had long since departed. What caught the eye, however, was the hand, his right, clenched into a hard, unnatural fist. Holmes knelt beside the body and examined it with quiet precision. He did not speak for several moments, save for a brief nod to Lestrade. "You've not moved the coin?" "No," Lestrade replied. "Didn't dare. No sign of violence. Nothing missing. He had no papers, no name, just that penny held like he'd fought someone for it." Holmes leaned close to the man's hand and sniffed lightly. "Almonds," he murmured. "You smell it too, Watson?" I bent low. A faint, sweet trace lingered in the air, subtle but distinct. "Cyanide," I said. "But no wound, no powder on the mouth." Holmes gently pried the man's fingers apart with a gloved hand. Within lay a single copper penny, old, dull with age, but curiously well preserved compared to the man who held it. Holmes held it to the light. "Interesting," he said. "Minted in 1887, the Queen's Jubilee year, these were limited and never widely circulated. Most were given as commemoratives." Lestrade raised an eyebrow. "A rare coin in a beggar's hand?" "A rare and deliberately chosen coin," Holmes corrected. "No thief would place such a thing, and no poor man would keep it merely for its sentiment." I stepped closer. "Holmes, do you suppose the poison came from the coin?" He nodded absently. "That remains to be tested, but note the rigidity of the hand, the constriction of the jaw, classic signs of cyanide toxicity, yet no oral ingestion. That points to contact. Transdermal application is rare, but not impossible." Holmes stood. "This was not a chance death, gentlemen. Someone placed this coin, and they wanted it to be found." Lestrade exhaled, frustrated. What sort of villain poisons pennies in Whitechapel? Holmes gave him a look of mild amusement. The sort of villain who wishes to be both charitable and cruel. He pocketed the coin carefully in a glass vial from his coat. Come, Watson, we must examine a list of known coin dealers, and I believe we'll need access to a certain private numismatic ledger. This Jubilee penny is not only rare, it is likely one of a very short run, which means it can be traced. Lestrade looked between us. You think this'll lead somewhere? Holmes's eyes gleamed faintly in the fog. Every coin has two sides, Lestrade. Let's find out whose hand held the other. Chapter 2. The Banker's Curse. It was scarcely 48 hours after our visit to Whitechapel that word came of a second death. This time the victim was no anonymous street wanderer, but a man of stature and wealth, well known among the financial circles of Lombard Street. The telegram arrived just after breakfast. Urgent. Victim found dead at desk, coin in hand. Same date, Lestrade. Holmes had already been deep in contemplation at the hearth, studying the copper penny taken from the beggar, when I read it aloud. At the mention of a second coin, his head tilted slightly, like a hound catching a familiar scent. Another death, he said, rising. And another coin. Rarely does murder repeat itself so precisely, unless repetition is part of the message. The offices of Farnham and Beadle Banking House were a study in polish and silence. Marble floors, deep leather chairs, and men in woolen coats too fine to wrinkle. The scene we found upstairs, however, disrupted the quiet order entirely. Mr. Edward Hollis, senior partner, and one of the firm's founding members, lay face forward across his oak writing desk. A ledger book had fallen open beneath him, blotched with ink from the overturned bottle nearby. His right hand hung limply over the desk's edge, and in his palm sat a single copper coin. Holmes moved immediately to the body, inspecting without delay. Lestrade stood by the door, arms folded, his face pale beneath its usual London grey. "Same coin?" I asked. Holmes nodded. "Precisely. A Jubilee penny. Minted 1887, no visible trauma, no forced entry. A man simply sat at his desk and died." I stepped closer and bent to observe the penny. Though dulled by the natural aging of copper, its design was remarkably clear, and I noticed something Holmes had already turned over in his mind. "The mint mark is pristine," I said. "No rub, no pitting, no edge wear. This coin has not changed hands in years." Holmes glanced up. "Indeed, Watson, this penny, like the one before it, was not in circulation. It was kept somewhere safe, somewhere dry, until its fatal use." Lestrade frowned. "What sort of killer keeps rare coins to poison people with? And how does a Whitechapel beggar have the same token as a banker in the city?" Holmes's response was quiet and deliberate. They were both given the same gift. He opened his notebook. "Do we know if Mr. Hollis had any recent visitors?" "A few appointments today," Lestrade said. "But no one saw anything unusual. His secretary was on her lunch. Fellow partners said he had been reviewing bad debts." "Debts," Holmes repeated. He stepped to the open ledger and, using a penknife, lifted a page already smeared with ink. His eyes moved swiftly over the columns. This ledger details a series of small business loans granted and recalled. "Note this entry here, Thistle and Cartwright, pawnbrokers, Brick Lane. Loan revoked in 1890. He flipped the page. "And here, Marlowe's chemist, Spitalfields. Loan extended, then terminated." He closed the book gently. These were not central clients, Lestrade. They were fringe debts, businesses tied to Whitechapel and its environs. A banker may never see the men he bankrupts, but they often remember him. I said nothing, but I could see the shape of the case forming in Holmes's mind, a pattern built not from cruelty for its own sake, but vengeance with intention. Someone was tracing a path backward through misfortunes long buried, and they were leaving their pennies like gravestones. Holmes turned to the window and looked down upon the street below, where carriages clattered and pedestrians hurried beneath a sky the colour of old tin. "There is a mind behind this," he said, "one with an accountant's precision and a bitter memory. 2 deaths, each a message delivered by hand. This is no random poisoner. It is an author writing his grievance in copper." He turned from the window. "Come, Watson, we must learn who once held these coins, and more importantly, who held a grudge against the men that died with them." Lestrade blinked. "You think this goes beyond the banker?" "I do," Holmes replied. "And if I am correct, another coin is already on its way." Chapter 3. The Ledger's Stain. It was a cold, brittle morning when Holmes and I returned to the offices of Farnham and Beadle. The streets outside still bore the chalk-white sheen of a late frost, and the iron railings steamed faintly from the sun that could not quite warm them. Holmes, wrapped in his grey Inverness cape, moved with brisk purpose as we crossed the marble threshold. Inside, the banking house had resumed its usual rhythm, though the absence of Mr. Hollis lent the atmosphere a strained quiet. The junior clerks kept their eyes on their ledgers, their pens scratching faintly like beetles behind wallpaper. We were shown to a side office by a thin man in spectacles, who introduced himself as Mr. Ridley, senior partner in the wake of Hollis's death. Holmes offered only the most cursory of greetings before requesting to examine the staff ledgers and employment records for the last 5 years. Ridley hesitated, clearly uncomfortable, but the shadow of Lestrade's authority, paired with the unsettling circumstances of Hollis's demise, persuaded him at last. Holmes took the bound register to a writing table by the window, where the light fell squarely across the pages. He began turning them with quiet efficiency, his fingers pausing now and again to make note of names and dates. "You are seeking patterns," I said. "Always," he replied without looking up. "Patterns, Watson, are the true footprints of the mind." Several minutes passed in silence until Holmes's hand stopped on a page dated April 1895. "Here," he said, "Edgar Vole, junior clerk, dismissed for suspected embezzlement. No conviction, but the internal report claims missing funds from the petty cash books." Notice how the handwriting changes abruptly in the weeks following. Vole's hand was steady and precise. His replacement was not. He ran a gloved finger along the margin, then frowned. "Watson, look here, on the right edge." I leaned in. A faint ink stain had bled into the parchment. It was not a blot in the traditional sense, but a curious smudge in the shape of a shallow crescent, with 3 feathered points along the lower edge. Holmes traced it gently. "This page was turned by someone whose right thumb bore wet ink, not from a fountain pen, but from a dipping quill. Observe the texture. The ridge here was made by a nail, likely long or misshapen. A man who handled documents carelessly, or perhaps one too agitated to bother blotting the excess." "You believe it was Vole?" "I believe this smudge is identical to one I saw in Hollis's private ledger, where the ink had spread in precisely the same shape. It is not merely coincidence, Watson. This is the same man. He read that ledger, possibly after hours, possibly by stealth." Holmes returned the employment book and turned to Ridley. "This Edgar Vole, was he ever charged formally?" Ridley shifted uneasily. "There was no evidence strong enough to pursue criminally. But the coincidence was uncomfortable. The funds vanished during his tenure. He was dismissed quietly." "And has he been heard from since?" "No, Mr. Holmes, not to my knowledge. He simply disappeared." Holmes closed his notebook. "Men who vanish, Watson, often do not vanish willingly. They are driven to it, and sometimes they resurface with purpose." As we stepped back out into the street, Holmes's eyes were already distant, his thoughts racing ahead of us. He poisoned with precision, selected rare coins as instruments, and left no direct trace. This is not the work of a madman. This is a man who remembers how he was erased. And now he is writing himself back into the record. I said nothing. The frost crackled faintly beneath our boots. "Come," he said suddenly. "We must find out where Mr. Vole last lived, and whether any pawnshops or chemists in Whitechapel recall a man who once dealt in ink, copper, and ruin." Chapter 4. The Phantom of Whitechapel. The following morning, Holmes and I descended once again into the labyrinthine streets of Whitechapel. The fog lingered in the alleys like an unspoken accusation, and the air bore the tang of coal smoke, horse dung, and something faintly medicinal. Holmes moved with that peculiar combination of detachment and attentiveness which marked his excursions into the grittier quarters of the city, where lives were lived hard and answers often came reluctantly. "Truth," he remarked as we passed a rag-and-bone shop, "is not a gentleman, Watson. It keeps poor company and seldom wears gloves." That, as it happened, was precisely what we were there to investigate. We began our inquiries near Hanbury Street, not far from where the first victim had been discovered. Holmes spoke with the proprietress of a soup kitchen, 2 flower girls, and a ginger-haired bootblack, gathering fragments of information with remarkable economy. I stood by, observing the way he stitched together stray details as easily as one threads a needle through loose cloth. At last, a gaunt man with a crooked back and a bristly beard, a watchman of sorts, paid by nearby shops to linger at night, offered a recollection that gave Holmes pause. "I seen him," the man said, squinting through watery eyes. 2, maybe 3 nights before that beggar went stiff. Gave him a penny right there, see? By the wall with the broken bricks. Dressed nice he was, better than most round here. Long grey coat, scarf, even though the night weren't cold. Odd thing, though, he had gloves on. Black ones. Leather, I think. Didn't take 'em off. Not even to dig in his pocket. Holmes's expression sharpened. "Did you notice anything else? His manner, perhaps?" The man scratched his chin. Moved careful, he did, like he was keeping something still. Hand shook a bit when he handed the coin over. Not like palsy, though. More like he didn't want anyone to see. Holmes leaned in. "Which hand?" "Right one," the man said after a moment's thought. Held the coins in his left, passed 'em with the right. Holmes straightened. "Thank you. That will do." We offered a few coins for the man's trouble and moved along. In the next hour, we received 2 similar reports. One from a lamplighter who had seen a well-dressed man distribute pennies to a crippled child near Mitre Square, and another from a woman selling roasted chestnuts who recalled the same grey coat and the same peculiarity, black gloves worn despite the mild spring air. The sightings all occurred within a few days of the beggar's death, and more troubling still, one of them coincided with the week prior to Mr. Hollis's collapse. "It is deliberate," Holmes said as we turned back toward Baker Street. "The coat, the gloves, the method. This man wishes to appear generous, yet he disguises the hand that kills." "Do you believe the gloves conceal a delivery device?" I asked. "I do," Holmes replied. "A prick of metal, perhaps, set within the fabric between thumb and forefinger, pressed into the coin as he hands it over. It would require precision, timing, and most of all planning." "Which implies motive?" "Precisely. And the trembling hand, Watson, that too is telling." "A symptom of guilt?" "Possibly. Or more likely, a side effect of the poison's preparation. Cyanide in particular can produce vapours if mishandled. A chemist would know how to mitigate that, but a layman might absorb trace amounts over time. Our man is methodical, but not immune to the tools he uses." Back at Baker Street, Holmes paced before the hearth while I made notes. "2 men dead," he said, and a third who stalks the streets offering death with the dignity of charity. He moves in daylight, leaves no name, and vanishes like a fog. And yet, Watson, he is no phantom. He is a man with a past, and that past is beginning to re-emerge. Holmes paused by the window and looked out toward the city's vast sprawl. I believe we are looking not merely for a killer, but for someone who feels wronged by the machinery of money and who has turned his revenge into ritual. I laid down my pen. And if he means to continue? Holmes turned from the glass. Then we must catch him before the next coin finds its final owner. Chapter 5. The Needle's Secret. When we returned to Baker Street that evening, Holmes's mood had shifted from inquiry to experimentation. I had seen this transformation before. His mind, once satisfied that it had gathered sufficient external data, turned inward and brisk, eager to test theory through practice. Without a word, he swept clear a portion of the breakfast table and produced a small, velvet-lined case from beneath the corner cabinet. Within were the familiar tools of his trade, a glass syringe, several lengths of fine silver wire, and a narrow vial of what I knew to be distilled prussic acid. He motioned for me to sit. "You recall the trembling hand described by the witnesses," he said, as he filled the syringe with slow and deliberate care. "I believe it is not the result of guilt or nerves, but the toll of repeated exposure. Our killer is working with a volatile compound, and his method, though clever, is not without risk to himself." I watched him work, the flicker of the lamp casting small gold flashes across the syringe's glass. "And the glove?" I asked. "Precisely the key," Holmes said. "A common pair of gentleman's gloves, perhaps purchased second-hand or tailored years ago, now altered. Observe." He withdrew from his desk a leather glove he had dissected earlier in the day. One fingertip had been sliced open and reinforced with a patch of canvas sewn beneath the inner lining. He had embedded the fine wire into this space, its point set to emerge exactly where the wearer's fingertip would press against an object during exchange. Consider, Watson, the distribution of coins. The giver holds the copper in his left hand, selects one, and transfers it to the right. As he presses it into the beggar's palm, the poisoned point hidden in the glove's finger pricks the surface of the coin. A micro bead of cyanide is transferred. The coin appears untouched. The death follows shortly thereafter. With hydrocyanic acid, it need not be more than a few milligrams. It acts swiftly through skin, particularly if the coin's recipient holds it with any tightness, or has even a minor abrasion. Holmes removed one of my own pennies from the sideboard and, with precise pressure, touched the syringe's needle to its surface. He held it to the light. "No discoloration, no residue. Now take this and examine it." I obeyed, turning the coin over in my hand. There was no visible indication that it had been tampered with. It bore no scent, no sheen, only the familiar copper chill. "Ingenious," I admitted. "Terrifyingly so," Holmes added. "It requires a steady hand and a cold resolve. One cannot poison a penny by accident. One must prepare, load, and deliver with calculation. This is not a madman, Watson. This is a craftsman of death." He removed the poisoned penny from my fingers with a small silver tong and placed it in a sealed envelope marked with a red cross. Then he wiped the table with carbolic and returned the syringe to its case. This demonstration proves the method is not only possible, but likely. The killer uses a simple disguise, a charitable gesture, and a fleeting moment of contact to deliver the fatal touch. I looked at him. "Then the gloves themselves are the weapon." Holmes nodded. "Indeed. And I should think, somewhere in the city, there is a discarded or hidden pair with the faintest trace of a compound that can kill a man before he can cry for help." He turned to the hearth, his silhouette dark against the orange glow. "Tomorrow we visit the last known address of Edgar Vole. If this theory holds, then it is not the glove we need most, Watson. It is the man who wears it. Chapter 6. The third target. It was just after luncheon, with Holmes sifting through the remnants of our morning correspondence, when the summons came. The message, once again from Lestrade, was brief but unmistakably urgent. "Another death. Magistrate John Whiting. Coin present. Come at once." Holmes handed me the telegram without comment and reached immediately for his coat. A pattern, Watson, begins to resolve itself. But now we must ask whether the pattern is nearly complete. Magistrate John Whiting had been found in his study at his Hampstead home, seated in his favourite armchair, an unopened newspaper on his lap, and his right hand clenched loosely over a single penny. His housekeeper had discovered him at 11:30, thinking him merely asleep. It was only when he did not respond to her greeting that she grew alarmed. Lestrade met us at the threshold of the drawing-room, his brow furrowed more deeply than usual. "No sign of a break-in," he said. "Window locked from within. No marks on the body. But this was found in his hand." He led us into the room where the body had already been examined by the coroner. On the small table beside the armchair, carefully laid out on a white handkerchief, was the coin. Holmes approached and bent low over it, retrieving his magnifying lens from his pocket. He remained silent for several moments, turning the object gently with a small pair of tweezers. When he straightened, there was a glint of interest in his eyes. "This is not an original," he said quietly. Lestrade frowned. "Not a real penny?" "A replica," Holmes replied. "A convincing one, cast rather than struck. Note the uneven rim, the subtle swelling around the Queen's profile, and the softness of the reverse lettering. This was not minted at the Royal Mint. It was poured in a mould, a poor one but sufficient to pass casual inspection." I looked closer. Now that he pointed it out, the details did seem less crisp, the relief less defined. Holmes continued, "The killer is running short, Watson, of original Jubilee pennies, that is. The first two victims received genuine coins, likely from a private collection or keepsake album. This one is artificial. The intention was the same, but the method betrays strain." Lestrade was scribbling rapidly. "So he's desperate or determined?" Holmes gave a small nod. "Both, I should think. But this victim differs in another important respect." He turned to me. "Do you recognize the name, Watson? John Whiting?" I frowned. "Not immediately, should I?" Holmes crossed the room and opened a small notebook he had brought from Baker Street. He leafed through its pages until he came to a marked entry, then tapped it with his finger. Magistrate Whiting presided over the internal inquiry at Farnham and Beadle. It was he who signed off on the dismissal of one, Edgar Vole. While the bank declined formal charges, Whiting upheld the termination. His written comments, though buried in administrative files, were blunt. Vole's character was marked as untrustworthy. The pieces once again began to fall into place. 3 victims, I said, each connected to Vole's disgrace. First, the beggar, likely a figure tied to Vole's former life. Then Hollis, who revoked the loans. Now Whiting, who sealed his dismissal. "Precisely," Holmes said. "This is no crime of passion. It is a measured progression, a ledger of revenge marked in copper." He folded his arms and gazed once more at the imitation coin. "But what is most curious," he added, "is that this counterfeit was laced with the same compound. Our killer has access to poison, and now to casting tools as well. The question is where." Lestrade stepped back. "And the more he uses, the more likely he is to slip." Holmes looked at him, his gaze sharp. "Not just slip, Lestrade. Repeat. Vengeance becomes compulsion, and compulsion leads to carelessness." He turned toward the door. "Come, Watson, if we find the workshop where this counterfeit was cast, we may yet catch the hand that forged it." Chapter 7. The 1887 Trail. It was just past noon the following day when Holmes, seated cross-legged on the carpet at Baker Street and surrounded by municipal records, bank ledgers, and correspondence from numismatic societies, gave a quiet murmur of satisfaction. "I have found it, Watson," he said, holding up a slim-bound volume as if it were a missing chapter of scripture. "The root, the origin, the seed of this grim pattern." He laid the book open upon the table and tapped a brief passage with one long finger. In June of 1887, to commemorate Her Majesty's Golden Jubilee, the directors of Farnham and Beadle commissioned a private striking of 50 limited-issue pennies. These were not merely commemorative, but made with slight modifications, a glossier finish, a narrower rim, and a ceremonial packaging. Each was engraved with a serial number and gifted to senior and junior staff as tokens of loyalty and service. I peered at the page. 50, I said. "That is rather more than I expected." Holmes gave a brief smile. But time has done some of the work for us. 20 were returned to the bank upon retirement and destroyed when the policy changed. 15 were sold privately. A dozen have surfaced in estate auctions over the years. Only 3 remain unaccounted for. Then our killer is using these remaining 3? 2, Holmes corrected. 1 was found in the hand of the beggar, the second with Mr. Hollis. The third, I suspect, is still in his possession. The counterfeit, you will recall, was found with Magistrate Whitting. Our man is conserving the originals, perhaps to make his last gesture particularly personal. Before I could reply, the bell rang sharply, and Lestrade was shown up to our sitting room, his face bearing the flush of recent triumph. "Well," he said, "we have him. Frederick Allerton, banker, rival of Hollis, known to have despised him for years, recently seen distributing coins to the poor as a show of charity. And more to the point, his name appeared in the old employment logs. I believe he and Vole worked together." Holmes regarded him with polite curiosity. "And your evidence? Beyond motive?" Lestrade asked. "We found several Jubilee pennies in his home, unaccounted for, and not reported among the documented auction sales. And his handwriting matches a note sent anonymously to Whitting's office last month, something about reckoning and long memories." Holmes stood, stretched slightly, and walked to his desk. From it, he withdrew a small square of white cloth and laid it on the table. Within it was a single banker's cuff, removed and preserved from Hollis's desk weeks earlier. The edge bore a faint, familiar smudge, curved like a crescent, slightly feathered at the edge. "May I see Mr. Allerton's cuffs?" Holmes asked. Lestrade, though mildly annoyed, produced them. They were clean, pressed, and without blemish. "Nothing?" he said after Holmes's brief inspection. "Nothing," Holmes replied. "No ink, no crescent, no trace. Nor does he have the hands of a man who works with volatile liquids or casting moulds. His fingernails are manicured, and his left thumb bears no callus where one would steady a crucible or lathe." Lestrade frowned. "Then you think he is innocent?" "I think," Holmes said quietly, "he is guilty of many things, but not of this." He handed the cuffs back. "Our killer is precise, economic in movement, obsessive in routine. He would never entrust his vengeance to a stranger, nor risk an accomplice. This is a solitary work, Lestrade, not a collaborative effort. And Mr. Allerton, while unpleasant, is not methodical enough to stage this." Lestrade sighed. "Then we are back to Vole." Holmes nodded. "And if I am not mistaken, the last penny will not be given to a stranger. It will be meant for someone Vole holds responsible above all others." He looked directly at Lestrade. "Tell me, my dear Inspector, did you not oversee the police handling of the Vole affair all those years ago?" Lestrade stiffened. I did. He was dismissed quietly. I followed protocol. Of course, Holmes said mildly. And if Vole blames you for failing to clear his name? Lestrade paled slightly. Then I am next. Holmes nodded once. Which means, Lestrade, you must be very careful about accepting charity over the next 48 hours. A kind man with gloves and a coin may wish to offer you more than just a penny. Chapter 8. The Gloved Hand. It was late in the evening, the kind of hour when London seems to hold its breath, when Holmes finally connected the last and most curious detail in the case, the ink stain. We had returned from an unproductive interview with the surviving clerks of Farnham and Beadle, and were both seated by the hearth, the coal fire snapping sharply in the quiet. Holmes was studying the stained banker's cuff once again, holding it to the light with a look of quiet certainty. "Watson," he said at last, "consider the ink. It is not commercial ink, nor from a clerk's pen. It is darker, oilier, and slightly flecked with grit. Printer's ink." I leaned forward. "Then the smudge did not come from a bank ledger." "Not originally," Holmes replied. "It came from the fingers of a man who handled type blocks, printing presses, and sheets damp with fresh pigment. Edgar Vole was once employed as a junior bank clerk, yes, but before that he apprenticed as a typesetter in Clerkenwell. It was mentioned briefly in the employment records." He rose and crossed the room, removing a marked map of London from the side cabinet. With a small brass pin, he tapped a location along Fleet Street. "There is an abandoned printing shop at the corner of Fleur-de-Lis Lane. It closed 5 years ago after a fire destroyed its upper rooms. The lower floor, however, remained intact. Its machinery was left unsold, and the property has changed hands twice without ever being reoccupied." Holmes turned to me. "I believe Vole has made it his workshop. It explains his access to ink, the availability of casting tools, and the privacy needed to assemble his devices." Within the hour we were joined by Lestrade and 2 constables, and together we made our way quietly to the address Holmes had identified. The street was narrow, lined with iron posts and shuttered windows. Gaslight flickered dimly against the soot-streaked stone. The building in question stood crooked between a newsstand and a boarded apothecary, its lower windows thick with dust. Holmes tried the door. It gave way with a long, reluctant creak. Inside, the scent was unmistakable. Old paper, burned wood, oil and ink mingled in the stagnant air. The press machines, hulking shadows beneath a canvas tarp, stood as silent sentinels. Holmes led us through with a lantern, stepping over warped floorboards and faded posters. At the back of the shop, behind a rusted platen press, we found a work table. Upon it lay a leather-bound notebook, a corked bottle of cyanide, 2 imitation Jubilee pennies, and, most damning of all, a single black glove. Holmes picked it up with the tips of his fingers. "Careful," Lestrade warned. But Holmes was already examining the glove's interior. "Here," he said, "between the index and thumb, a channel sewn into the leather, lined with fine wire. Press here, and—" A narrow steel needle extended with a soft, mechanical whisper. It was barely visible to the eye, no longer than a pin, and wickedly sharp. Holmes retracted it and set the glove down. He engineered it to spring with pressure. When handing over a coin, his touch would activate the needle just long enough to puncture or coat the surface. I looked over the notes laid out beside it. Pages of careful script recorded each victim, dates, grievances, street names, and final observations. The beggar's entry was marked simply, "Test successful." Hollis's read, "Debt reconciled." Whitting's, the most recent, ended with "False justice corrected." He examined the pages more closely. "There is one more entry, a name written but with no details filled in." He turned the book to show us. At the bottom of the final page, written in firm, steady hand, was a single word: Lestrade. The inspector blanched. He meant to kill me. Yes, Holmes said calmly, but not today. He has not yet returned for the final coin. He will come back here to retrieve it. Lestrade looked at the table, at the glove, and at the notebook which recorded his name like a gravestone. Holmes rolled the glove in a piece of cloth and handed it to the constable. "We have found his mind," he said. "Now we must find his face." Chapter 9. The Cuff Betrayal. Though the night had drawn in heavy and thick, we remained stationed outside the old printer's shop in silent anticipation. Holmes had insisted we not disturb the layout of the table, the glove, nor the final coin. The trap, he said, must be left exactly as its maker designed it, for only then might its designer return. Hours passed in chill and hush, broken only by the occasional rattle of a passing cart or the clatter of boot heels on cobbled stone. Holmes stood as still as the press machine beside him, his gaze fixed not on the door, but on the shadows dancing along its lower edge. It was just past 3 o'clock when we heard the lock rattle softly. A key turned with a faint scrape, and the door creaked inward. A figure stepped cautiously into the gloom. Thin, average height, wrapped in a grey coat. He paused just inside the doorway, scanning the shop by the light of a small lantern. Holmes gave a slight motion, and the constables moved swiftly, but the man saw the shift of shadow and bolted. In the space of seconds he darted back into the street, nearly slipping on the damp flagstones. Lestrade gave chase, shouting for him to halt, but the man vanished around the corner with the agility of one who had rehearsed this escape 100 times. We followed, but he was gone into the alleys before a perimeter could be set. Only the heavy coat remained, cast off beside a drain grating in haste. Holmes retrieved it with gloved hands and examined the lining, his expression one of thoughtful calm rather than frustration. "He will try again," he said softly. "A man who thinks by lists does not deviate from them." He brought the coat inside and spread it on the table beneath the gaslight. "Note the wear here, Watson, at the right cuff," he said. "The inner lining is frayed, and here. Look closely." Holmes pointed to a silver cufflink still attached to the right sleeve. Around its edge, barely visible to the naked eye, was a faint, crescent-shaped stain. It had the oily sheen we had seen before, and bore the same curious three-pronged feathering at the base. Holmes turned to Lestrade. "This is it. The same ink as on the bank ledger, the same pattern. He cannot escape his own signature." Lestrade leaned in, squinting. "It is identical." Holmes smiled faintly. "The devil, my dear Watson, is always in the details. This stain is his signature, as surely as any thumbprint. A man may hide his face, he may change his name, but he cannot undo the habits of his hand." He carefully detached the cufflink, wrapped it in cloth, and placed it into his pocketbook. "Let this be the last trace he leaves," Holmes said, "for the next one must be him." Chapter 10. The Dockside Confrontation. The pursuit resumed before dawn. Lestrade, working with quiet efficiency and a growing sense of urgency, had distributed notices to every dock watchman between Limehouse and Southwark. Holmes had predicted it precisely. If Vole were to flee, it would be through the web of alleys and wharves that skirted the Thames, where a man could vanish into the fog and be on a steamer bound for the continent by sunrise. We received the alert at 5:30. A night porter at the East India Docks reported a man matching Vole's description, seen boarding a coal barge moored at a secluded berth. Within minutes we were in a hired carriage, its wheels slicing through the damp morning streets as London slowly stirred from sleep. The air at the docks was sharp with brine and oil, the silhouettes of cranes rising like iron skeletons against the pale sky. Holmes, Lestrade and I descended the gangway of the barge quietly, flanked by 2 constables. The deck creaked beneath our weight. Then we saw him. Edgar Vole stood alone near the prow, facing the dark water. He was thinner than I remembered from the employment records, his cheeks hollow and his eyes ringed with sleeplessness. He wore no hat. In his right hand he held something glinting faintly in the light, a penny. He turned at the sound of our approach. His face, half shadowed beneath the grey sky, betrayed no surprise. "You've come at last," he said quietly. Holmes stepped forward. "It ends here, Mr. Vole. No more coins, no more names." Vole raised the penny slowly and pressed it against his own lips. With his left hand, he reached inside his coat, fingers fumbling for something concealed. Holmes was quicker. In one motion, he strode forward and seized Vole's wrist, twisting it gently but firmly. A faint click echoed as the glove mechanism extended, a tiny needle protruding from the leather at the base of Vole's thumb. Holmes held his arm steady and spoke with clear disdain. "You've treated life as cheaply as these coins." Vole said nothing. His eyes flicked to the water below, then to the poisoned penny still clutched in his other hand. "Spare me the gallows," he muttered. Holmes took the penny from him gently, wrapping it in a handkerchief. "No, you must live, Mr. Vole. You must face the cost of your arithmetic." Lestrade and the constables stepped in, securing the glove, the false coin, and Vole himself. The former clerk did not resist. He sagged under their grasp, like a man emptied of purpose, his terrible mission now complete in his mind, though halted by justice. As the barge rocked gently beneath our feet and the city began to glow with the orange blush of morning, Holmes stood silently at the railing, watching the constables lead Vole away. I joined him there. "Do you pity him?" I asked. "No," Holmes said softly. "But I understand him." He turned toward me, the breeze catching the edge of his coat. "Vole built a world of symbols, Watson. Numbers, signatures, ledgers, and ink. When that world turned on him, he tried to rewrite it in blood. But even vengeance must obey its own rules. And in the end, it was not rage that betrayed him. It was the ink on his cuff." Chapter 11. Justice's Wait. The trial of Edgar Vole was swift and public. The evidence was irrefutable. The poisoned glove, the counterfeit coins, the journal of grievances written in his own hand. The testimony of Holmes and the forensic specialists established his guilt with undeniable clarity. What was perhaps most striking was Vole's own statement to the court. He did not plead for mercy nor deny his actions. Instead, he gave a quiet, deliberate account of his descent. "They paid to destroy me," he said from the witness box, his voice low but steady. "Each man who took part in my dismissal did so with ink, with coin, and with indifference. I thought it fitting they should meet justice the same way." The courtroom was still as he continued. "A coin is trust, is it not? It passes from hand to hand with the unspoken promise of value, but their coins were poison to me. My ruin began with a single signed letter, a line in a ledger, a denied appeal. I had no voice, only memory, and so I repaid them with what they gave me, copper and cruelty." The judge, unmoved by this logic, delivered the sentence: life imprisonment without possibility of parole. The courtroom emptied quietly, the weight of justice resting heavier than usual in the stale air. Several evenings later I found Holmes seated by the fireplace at Baker Street, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. The documents of the case were spread out before him, though I suspected he had ceased reading them long ago. He was studying a small object between his thumb and forefinger, a cast replica of a Jubilee penny, the last of Vole's forgeries, preserved for the record. "Justice was served," I said, taking the chair opposite. "Yet you seem unsettled." Holmes gave a faint nod. "Because justice, Watson, is not always tidy. It does not always feel like victory. Vole was not mad, not in the way the word is commonly used. He was wounded, profoundly so, and instead of healing, he shaped his wound into a tool." He turned the coin over in the firelight. These were not simply tokens to him, they were symbols. Every penny was a weight he felt pressed upon him, a tally of shame and dismissal. He forged them, not merely to kill, but to restore a warped sense of balance. Holmes stood, walked to the hearth, and held the coin above the flames. "The irony, of course," he said, "is that the men he hunted had long forgotten him. While he remembered every word, every signature, every slight, they moved on. It was his obsession with the past that truly doomed him." With a flick of his fingers, he released the coin. It arced briefly, caught the light like a tiny spark, and disappeared into the fire with a quiet hiss. Holmes turned back to me, his eyes unreadable. "The true crime, Watson, is never the poison," he said. "It is the pride that administers it." Epilogue. In the weeks that followed, London returned to its ordinary rhythm. The newspapers soon turned their attention to other matters: parliamentary squabbles, railway expansions, and the odd society scandal. Edgar Vole's name faded from the headlines, but not from Holmes's files. The counterfeit pennies were turned over to Scotland Yard, locked in evidence drawers alongside stranger relics of crime. Yet one detail lingered with me. The quiet moment at Baker Street, Holmes watching the fire, the last false coin swallowed by the flames. Sometimes justice is not a matter of law but of memory. And Holmes, ever the observer of mankind's odd corners, never forgets a mind that dares to balance its own scales. Thank you for joining us for the case of the poisoned penny, a tale where even the smallest coin carries the heaviest intent. If you enjoy stories where deduction meets darkness, and where Holmes faces not just criminality but obsession, make sure to stay with us. And as always, if you love classic mysteries, chilling atmosphere, and brilliant deductions, don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring the bell for more cases from the Drawing Room Detectives. Your next mystery begins with one click. Till next time, goodbye, and keep your wits sharp.